In today's episode, we're going to paint this Space Marine Scout as part of the Iron Hands chapter requested by my viewers over on Twitch. And we're going to do start to finish paint on this mini on a how to paint for tabletop gaming. Okay, so I've primed this black, and obviously the armor being black, that's the last thing that I'm going to actually go and paint. So the first thing I will paint though is the cloth. Now the request that the viewers had was to paint the cloth in gray or khaki. Because we're going to be highlighting the black with the gray colors, we're going to go ahead and use browns or khakis, khaki-ish color. So the colors that I've chosen for the cloth is going to be XV88 from Citadel, followed up by Screaming Skull from Citadel as well. So the first thing you want to do is obviously mix up your paints. The XV88 happens to be a air version. I usually like the air versions because they're a little more thin, watered down, and they apply pretty smooth. So what I'm going to do is the first coat is going to be very, very thin and quick. I'm not going to cake on the paint. So what I'll do is I'll just allow the paint to go on nice and thin and have some of that black primer showing through. It's okay if you have some of the primer or paint underneath showing through, because we'll come back over and then we'll do a second coat. Now it's important to know that when you do paint the first coat, you want to make sure that you get a clean coverage all the way through. So when you do have streaks like this, you want to try to avoid having the paint underneath show through, because as we give the model a wash or as we add the next highlight, you'll end up having to work around that section, which can be a real pain to do. So again, I'm just going over quickly and adding the base coat of XV88. I believe if you use the regular layer paint, this will go a little bit quicker, but because I'm using the XV88 Air version, it is going on pretty thin. So although you do only need really 2 coats from my experience, with this paint being very thin as it is, I may need a 3rd coat. Okay, so anything that you want cloth will be painted with this color. So we've got the pants done there. Next we want to move on over here to the arms, which will also be cloth. Now, if you haven't gone ahead and already primed your mini, I have primed this mini black. I find that painting tabletop miniatures with black paint first, or black primer first, really helps hide some of the details that you will definitely miss. As tabletop miniature painting goes, it doesn't have to be amazing looking for gaming. However, you do want your best looking work at least on the table, and black tends to hide some of your mistakes. Whereas if you prime it white or gray, that color may, or the mistakes might be emphasized a little bit more. So the other thing that we want to paint up is the eagle on the chest. So we'll paint that up black. Now there's a technique called an inside out technique, which implies that you're going to paint the miniature from the inside to the outside, as to not work on other sections of the miniature and spend a lot of time on, and then, screwing it up by painting something that's all the way on the inside. So I'm working on the inside out, so that way if I do get paint on this shoulder pad or anywhere else, I'll cover that up later with the colors that are supposed to go there. So I'm not too worried about it. So by the time I finished the eagle already, I can come back and actually start adding my second coat over here. Again, since XV88 is very thin, I'm going to most likely come back in and do a 3rd coat. So I'm going to be doing this live with you guys from start to finish, meaning I'm not going to cut out any scenes or anything like that. The only scenes that I may cut out is dry time, especially if this is going to take a while to dry, and then we can come back to it. But the actual layering process and putting the paint down, I will keep running now, so that way you guys can see the process that I go through. Obviously, I paint live on Twitch, so a lot of my viewers get to see me paint from start to finish. Sometimes the miniatures may take 2 or 3 days to finish, but I'm going to try to do this tutorial in a quick 1 hour series if I can, to help viewers or you guys, anybody, to really get miniatures done within an hour, at most maybe 2, because we understand armies can be fairly large, especially if you play IG, or they're not even called IG anymore, right? But if you're painting up guardsmen or nids or Tau, no, not Tau, but any of those armies with many miniatures, you don't want to be spending 5 hours per mini. So there we go. That's a cloth. I'm going to do the eagle one more time. Okay. So the other eagle that I have to do is this section right here, or with the skull. But I'm going to come back to that later. The reason I'm not going to do that, again, from the inside-outside technique, we're going to paint this bolter a different color, and we may get it on this. So I'll come back and I'll touch up on that later when we're finished with the bolter. Okay, so I'll put this guy on the side for a little bit, let it dry. May put a third coat on, and then we'll come back. Okay, and we're back. So I've let the model sit and dry for a few minutes, and I've applied the third coat as well. One of the things I realized I didn't mention as to why I painted this brown first. I was talking about the black undercoat and how you can see through the paint when you lay the layers of brown. Well, I wanted to lay the brown down first, so that way we can go ahead with the next coat of Screaming Skull. Once the Screaming Skull goes on, we're going to give it an Agrax Earthshade wash, and that wash, obviously being brown, will tie in pretty nicely with this brown color versus the black. So with that being said, I'm going to move over again to Screaming Skull. Now remember, you do want to thin down your paints, so I'm going to transfer some of this paint over to my wet palette over here. If you don't know how to make a wet palette, or don't know what a wet palette is, I'll make a video shortly on how to make a wet palette or what it's used for. If you do have one, or even a dry palette, it is better than no palette. So try to move your paint over to a wet palette or dry palette, and then add some water to it to thin your paint consistency down a little. And then we'll add a couple of thin coats or thin layers. For now, you don't have to be as crazy with it. You don't have to do something like that where you leave little gaps. You can just paint through the whole section, the whole area that you just painted brown. Because again, you will have some of that brown show through. And after the first coat, we'll go back in and do a second coat where we could be a little bit more cautious as to where we put the paint. And again, that brown undercoat is going to be very helpful later on in transitioning and tying in the ink wash or shade that we're going to use with the Screaming Skull. And again, just a couple of thin coats. One of the basic techniques for miniature painting is to not put on thick layers of paint. You do want to put down thin layers. This way you can control the consistency and control how much paint goes on the actual miniature. And it's always easier to add a little bit more paint for areas that you need more paint versus trying to take away. So keep that in mind. Okay, let's move over to arm now. By the time we finish the arm and the eagle on the chest, the paint on the pants should have dried, and then I can show you what I mean about doing that second coat a little bit more controlled, only in the areas that you want the highest points to be highlighted. Okay, and again for the actual bolter itself, this section here, and I realized this little skull over here, we'll end up painting those after, towards the very end. Okay, so as you see, the paint on the pants have already dried, and what we're going to do now is you can see that the brown is still showing through the Screaming Skull. So what we want to do is the highest areas, such as the knee over here, we want to add paint just in those areas. And obviously with the folds, you want to paint towards the very tops. I call them hills. Like if you think of like a hill and a valley, the recessed areas would be the valley areas and the hill would be the top areas of the fold. Try to focus more on painting just Screaming Skull right around the hills. So for example, if you look over here, I left a small little area with just one coat of Screaming Skull, whereas the kneecap area here, and then this hill over here, I've painted 2 coats. And because it's not straight black or straight brown, but it does have a thin layer of Screaming Skull on there, when we do add that shade again, it'll tie it in and create a warmer, darker shade of this Screaming Skull, which will help with the transition and the feeling of that fold being darker, not just from the wash, but it'll make it look a little more realistic. Again, just applying another thin coat. You don't want to apply the paint too thick, so use a little bit of water to thin down your paints. A big flat open area like this thigh right over here, you can paint a little bit thicker because we want that consistency of just that beige or that Screaming Skull color. Here we go. Now, if you do happen to make a mistake, no worries. Don't worry if you get too much beige paint everywhere, or if you miss the valley and you painted over it or whatever. You know, we can always come back. The shading will actually hide a lot of that. And again, the black paint, or the black primer I should say, will mask a lot of those mistakes. If you painted or primed it in white, you'll see all those mistakes. Now, as far as for the chest eagle, the way I like to do it is I like to flatten out my brush by pressing the paintbrush down into the paint. And by flattening out the brush, I'll do this a little bit more when I highlight, but I like to pull and drag it. This way you leave a little bit of brown underneath those valleys, I should call, or whatever you want to call, where they connect for each wing that separates. So I like to pull it just to leave a little bit of brown paint under there. That's it for the actual Screaming Skull. Now the pan area is pretty dry, so I'm going to go ahead and shake up and use a little bit of Citadel's Agrex Earthshade. And then after we apply this, you will let it sit for about 10 minutes or so to dry completely. Now when you do apply the shades, you don't have to apply this straight out of the pot as well. You can actually thin this down a little bit further by adding a little bit of water. Again, I would rather put down thin layers versus one thick layer, even for the shade. So this is just a little bit of a mixture of water and shade that we're applying. Now if you get the shade all over the place, it's okay to start, right? Because what we'll do is we'll come over and we'll actually suck some of the shade off from areas that where it pulls up too much. But we would rather try to make sure that the shade hits up all the areas at once without missing a spot. If you miss a spot and then come back to it, the shade will actually change to a darker color in areas that you've already touched, and it'll be lighter in areas that you touched for the first time. So you do want to try to hit up the entire area at one time without allowing it to dry before coming back and doing another coat. If you do want the clothing to be a little darker, because like that's a little light over here, I'll come back to it and add another dark coat here. Let that dry. I did put that on a little bit thicker with less water. Now the important thing about shade that you have to keep in mind is watch out for pooling. So like for example, right over here where there's a lot of shade, you want to put the paintbrush on there and suck up some of that wash or that shade so it doesn't pool up too much. Okay, and that's really it. We're going to let that sit and dry a little bit, and then we'll come back to it once it's dry. The clothing is pretty much done here. Now, the only other thing that we'll have to sit and do after this dries is work on the armor. So stay tuned, and we'll see you guys in a bit.